Okay, we are set up and ready to go. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Desiree Hill at Des Hill, and I'm really happy to be able to present to you today some of my thoughts about Twitter. And what you're going to find in my presentation today is we're going to have three sections. We're going to have a section, just an introductory section on some various thoughts about Twitter that I think might be beneficial to you. Then I'm going to share a little bit of my own research on Twitter. And then the last section is going to be what should you be tweeting? If you are sort of thinking, gee, I still don't know what kind of social media presence I should have or have not. And I'm going to have a list for you that I came up with through some consulting work I did with television journalists who were struggling with this concept. So we're going to dive in to our first section, the introductory section. And I'm going to share a quote with you that I think is really good that exemplifies Twitter and really social media to a great extent. It is that Twitter left a ball and a stick in a field and lurked on the sidelines as its users invented baseball. And what this really means is that when Twitter first started in the mid 2000s of that decade, it was really designed as an SMS service, a short message system, sort of like tweeting, or I'm sorry, not tweeting, texting. And so what ended up evolving is what we have today, which is millions and millions of users all over the world who use Twitter in a variety of different ways. One of which that I am most interested in is news. So the inventors of Twitter weren't setting out to invent this, massive social media structure. They were simply trying to communicate slightly differently via uh, cell phones. And the users themselves have really been part of the creator of what it has become. And we can really see this thread throughout different social media services. The users really begin to find unique ways to use these new uh, social media ideas that come around that are created by tech people. So I think this is a really good way to sort of orient your mind into the world that we're in and the idea that nothing is going to be settled. Any social media that comes on the forefront will not be, oh, this is what it is and this is what it's going to be. It is going to evolve. And your generation and you folks in this room are really going to be tasked with utilizing these services and using them creatively and ethically down the road, and just realize that nothing is going to be settled. And the other piece that I want to put in our introduction as we think and as we start to think about this today is your students. And many of you in the classroom have probably used some kind of social media product for many years, starting in your teenage years, starting in your formative years. And what I want to underscore about this class is just because you do have Twitter, just because you do have Facebook or other social accounts and you've used them for years, doesn't mean that you understand how to use these services and platforms for communities, for audiences, for clients. And that's why it's so important for us to come together and think about best practices. And so the other part is that's kind of a sister to that statement is you know how to use the technology. It doesn't mean that you yet know how to think about it. And it does come down in a lot of ways to the writing. We are putting words on these platforms. And so for me, one of the unifying factors is it's about the content that you're sharing. And to think about good writing is good writing, whether it's on Twitter or in a newspaper article, and a reminder that grammar does matter. So it is a slippery slope. You start using, abbreviations and wrong spelling and wrong this and that, and suddenly all the rules are out the window. So I believe in those three things when it comes to the writing on these platforms. The other thing that the other sort of side of this coin is that when you go into the workplace, you will be representing your employer. And that is how a lot of news organizations want their employees to think about their social media use. So you may have deeply personal views and deeply private thoughts and beliefs that you want to share, but you're also representing your employer when you do that. So you need to give a second thought when you put certain things up. This is why we do see some people being fired after they tweet something racist or put something racist up on Facebook, or a joke that might be sexist or homophobic. So you are representing your employer, and many employers, that is how they see this. So, one way to counter this and to avoid these problems is to think about everything you say on social media. And we're going to focus on Twitter. Would you say this in public? Would you go to the public square? Would you go to the Nye University Center and stand out front and shout it to people as they walk by? So don't do anything that you wouldn't want to say in public out loud. And then assume that what you write is going to become public. It's going to become viral. Of course, it's not always going to be, but assume that something you put out there is going to live forever in the cloud. So, an example of this would be a student recently was asked to be on a podcast that had a political view, and she was on that podcast. She did agree to do it, and she showed me her work on that and what she said. She did a fabulous job. They wanted her to be partisan, they wanted her to say certain things, they were trying to ask her questions. But the thing that I said to her is she had to remember that that was going to live, that piece of video of her could live forever and be Googled by an employer. So assume that anything you say could become very public. And that's, I think, a good way to sort of put a guide on yourself. This is a little piece here, and I'm going to leave this up for a second, that one news organization uses in its company handbook when it comes to their policies on social media use. And I've underlined and put in red some of the really important pieces here. That what they do is they want journalists to refrain from tweeting and sharing things that could be perceived, and I'm going to go to the first underlined portion, reflecting political, racial, sexist, religious, or other bias or favoritism that could be used to tarnish, in red, your journalistic credibility. And credibility, of course, we have connected credibility to journalism for as long as journalism has existed. But it also is your own credibility, whether you in this room are planning to be a journalist. You start off on day one with sort of this equal footing, this sort of like you're not uncredible. You're not, you have you're starting to build a brand. But once you start doing things to tarnish your brand, especially for journalists, you start to lose credibility to a point where you may lose a job, you may lose an audience, you may lose favorability with audiences, which could affect your position, especially in television. And so these are things for you to think about that exist in company handbooks in journalism organizations across the country. You also further the other things I've underlined here: offensive comments about race, gender, appearance, disabilities, age, sexual orientation, pornography, religious beliefs and practice, political beliefs, or offensive comments about national origin. So these are things to think about. Because again, you may delete a tweet, but if someone has screenshotted it, because what you said was so shocking, and this has happened to people, then it's going to be out there and it's going to be in the public sphere, and it could harm you later on. So you should refrain from those things. Now, where do we start? I mentioned, the basics about the writing earlier on. Theories, we think about our journalism theories that we learn. Those of you who have taken the intro to mass comm classes, and it's classes where you start to learn about theory. You can apply some theories to Twitter. The idea of gatekeeping theory in journalism. What some people say about social media is that now what we are is gate watchers. So journalists are watching what's coming through from the public. We need to think about our ethics. And so you can apply the things that you learn in ethical class, an ethics class, to how you're going to use social media. And this is just a graphic of one way that we look at our social media networks. And, you know, this isn't anybody that we know. This is just an example of how we study these networks. And the bigger dots are people who have more followers, and the colors of the dots reflect who all is in that network. So Lennyism, you can see in this example, has the most followers, but also is connected to various individuals. And then you can see others. And we can use this type of network analysis to actually look at polarization, to look at how people follow their blue network or their red network politically, and they don't really cross paths sometimes. And so this is just a little, I'm not going to get into a lot of that. I think it's a really interesting area of study. It's not my area of research, but it's just a visualization. If you're a visual learner and you want to think about this in a different way, this is what you look like in the network. And so you might think about how your network might look. Now we're going to transition to chapter 1 of our presentation today. And I'm going to start with my own research on Twitter. And this is actually from my thesis that I did when I was getting my master's degree. And I'm an older person. I didn't get my master's until I was a little bit older. And I was really fascinated by Twitter. And I wanted to learn about it. I wanted to study it. And there really hadn't been any research done about it as I was looking into my own academic articles and places where I could start to study this. So I decided to do a baseline study of a news market in the United States to just take a snapshot of what was being done in that moment. And the title of my thesis had the phrase in it, chasing the greased pig. Because the greased pig, if you know, some of you've been to Oklahoma, fairs or rodeos where they grease up a pig and a bunch of people chase that pig, and it's really hard to catch because it's got grease on it. And that's how I see social media, is that we will never, ever catch up to our journalism industry, will never catch up to really knowing how to manage this topic of social media, because it's just going to always evolve. And so what I was interested in was this baseline study of what I called an average television or news market in the United States. And I was going to look at the content of the tweets. I was going to categorize categorize the content. I was going to look into the interactivity with viewers and users, and also talk to managers about how they were managing this new form of media. And in this study, so interestingly enough, I got my master's at the University of North Texas, but I decided to use Tulsa as my market of study. And Tulsa is a great market to study because it's sort of middle of the country as far as size. It was not that far from where I was. I actually knew people in that market, so I knew I would have access. It wasn't too close though, because I'd worked in Oklahoma City, and so Tulsa was a little bit removed from my own personal work, and I liked that. It also had an interesting ownership grouping in the market of different television stations owned by one station owned by Griffin here, which is Channel 9 in Oklahoma City. So sort of a family-owned company, but also another station owned by Scripps, which is a large journalism company. The newspaper I also included in the study, as well as one of the radio stations, which also was tweeting. There was only one radio station in my study that was actually doing a lot of tweeting. And so again, Tulsa in TV talk is market size 59 out of about 215 markets in the country. And so it's a nice size number, not too large. You don't really want, if I look at New York City, that's not very realistic for the smaller markets. If I look at a tiny market, well, that's not very applicable to larger markets. So that medium-sized market I thought was interesting for study. And I did 2 phases of the study. The first phase I did for my thesis in 2010, and then I came back a couple of years later and did a follow-up companion study just to see what had changed. And I also revisited managers in that market a year later for more anecdotal information about their experiences. So what I did was I took a 7-day period, quote, normal 7-day period. And when I mean normal, and this is a little research insight, you didn't really want to have a week that was really weird, or unusual. Like you wouldn't have the week of the election because that's a crazy week, or a week of a tornado. I wanted just a normal news week to do this study. And I looked at various categories, and you can see the list here. I looked at normal stuff like crime, government, health, business, traffic, immediacy, breaking news, fires, and feature stories. I didn't look at sports. That wasn't part of the study. And I also would have put weather as a separate entity. So weather was not included. I just wanted to look at traditional news content. And so I guess what I would ask you is, what do you think the top content area in 2010 would be? And so this might be a good place if you want to discuss for a moment and pause the screen and talk about what you think would have been the number one content area. And what I mean by that is we counted all of the tweets I did and said, these are all I wrote down every single tweet that was sent in that 7-day period. And then I started to put them in these content buckets to see what we would see. So I'll let you pause if you want, and you can discuss what you think the top content area would have been in 2010. Okay, so it's a little bit in the order that I had, maybe a little bit different, but the number one content area was crime. And again, I looked at 4 television stations, the main newspaper in town, and 1 radio station. And so crime came in at the top. Not really surprising when you look at our coverage in general of content. Number 2 was government. Traffic and accidents was kind of tied with feature, and then everything else was fairly low on the list with only a few tweets in those categories. And again, this was 1 week in 2010. So a lot different than what we would see today for a number of reasons. And then I compare to 2012. And so you see that by 2012, more tweeting was going on by the station. And when I say station, I also want to clarify. Nowadays, you have talent tweeting, you have reporters tweeting, you have photographers tweeting, you have all kinds of people putting out tweets as part of their news entity. And this case, I was only looking at the main brand. So it would have been like KOTV News on 6, period, not all of the reporters on News on 6. That would have been a whole different study. But you see by 2012, I'll put it back real quick, that the numbers had really exploded as to more tweeting happening. By 2012, we saw that actually there were a lot more government tweets at that time, state government, legislative, that sort of thing. And then feature stories were also 133, came in 3rd place. So what does that tell us? To some people, it may just look like a bunch of words and numbers on a screen. What this tells us is that actually Twitter was not being used enough on breaking news. So if we go back and we look at this, we'd see immediacy, 66 in 2012, and 2010, only 12. And so that is breaking news. And so one of my overall findings was that people were not journalists and journalism organizations hadn't really caught on to what Twitter was about. It's about breaking news. It's about right now. It's about the here and now. And so one example would be that there was an Amber Alert in 2012, and Amber Alerts are highly popular with audiences. They know that they work. They know that they are life or death sometimes. And so, the stations weren't really doing enough of those kinds, and in the newspaper, enough of those kinds of topic areas. So breaking news. And that was one of my, I think, large findings of these studies. The other finding that I had was writing on Twitter, that the writing style does need a little bit of its own customization when you're writing for Twitter. And so these were some examples of tweets from my study. And the first one was, okay, kind of a headline, attempted abduction leads to school lockdown. And so my recommendation on this was that we've got to be, as I say here in my bullet, where is this? When is it? Is it now? Because if you're a parent and you're catching this, you're like, is this my child's school? Is it breaking right now? Is there a person still out there? And so there are plenty of characters, enough characters on Twitter to be able to share some of that information. Here's a good example here, this traffic update that KOTV put out. So they use capital letters at the beginning to sort of draw your attention. So there's a tip for you that even though Twitter is sort of has limitations, you can use capitalization for good purpose as needed. But they had a fatality accident. They told where it is, Highway 75 northbound near 61st Street. And then they gave a good tip for audiences to get by. And so this was an example of a good tweet. So if you're, writing for news purposes, you've got to think about, really every word counts. And you've got to be strategic about what that user may need in that moment. Here's another example from 2010, KTUL. They had another, a gas line break forces highway shutdowns, didn't give the highway, didn't give any other detail, and wanted people to go to a website. Okay, that's fine. Send us to a website. We don't mind, but it's kind of incomplete in that, because there are a lot of reasons that I may not want to go to that website right now, even though you've provided that to me. For example, I say it here in the second point, links to websites are good, but if I'm busy, I don't have time maybe to go to your website. I may have a low battery right now. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I look down and I'm at 1%. And it's like right at that moment that I need that information. Some people have data, limitations. And so websites have a downside for some people. So don't use that as an excuse to share incomplete details. The other finding that I had was, if you go back and you think about that content list, crime being number one in 2010, government being number one in 2012, basically what the content on Twitter was looking like, coming from these news entities, it was looking like the front page of a newspaper. It was looking like the first block of a newscast. And the thing is that you have to adapt your content to the social media platform itself. You can't just say, these are the stories we're covering today, let's put those on Twitter. You have to say, what stories fit Twitter best? What stories should we maybe do some live tweeting from? If we're at a governmental meeting, that's really important, as we've seen during the COVID crisis. We've had these really important announcements coming from the governor and coming from the mayor. We need to be live tweeting those meetings. And it may be different than how you're going to cover it in the newspaper or how you're going to put it on your newscast. So you need to think about that all the way through with every single form of social media that you use. What is the best way for us to communicate on Facebook? Are we on TikTok? How are we going to handle that for content purposes? The other finding that I had in my research was a concern that managers were not managing social media. They were not, in some cases, they were not engaged with it. They weren't even on it themselves. So therefore, they weren't hands-on with it. They really didn't understand how it worked. And therefore, they could have been missing some important problem areas. So that leads to the idea that no matter where you work, you do need to have a social media policy for your staff. So those were some of my findings in my research. Bottom line, as I mentioned a little bit, a few slides ago, you've got to think about the medium itself, and you've got to transmit the information in a way that suits that medium the very best, not just the traditional way. We tend to, in our industry, we tend to think very traditionally about new forms of media. And part of that's just because we're human. We are bounded by our thought, our brains and our minds, and all we know is what we already know. And so we have to be open to the unknown. And how do we learn about the unknown? Well, we start using it, we start studying it, we start reading about it, we start looking at research about it. Research isn't, gee, I talked to my friend and this is what they said. What we call that is a focus group of one in the industry, which isn't very well regarded. Research is, you talk to 500 people and you find out what they say. So you start studying that research and you learn more about how to use these new forms of media. So now we're going to transition to chapter 2. And I don't know if Joe would like to pause this for discussion or underscore anything or disagree with anything I've said. But I'm going to transition now to chapter 2, and that is, what should journalists tweet about? And this came about because I was hired to go to a television station in Illinois to help them with their social media strategies. The news organization was finding that there were certain journalists who, maybe, I don't want to call them old school, because you can be a young person and be old school. You can be an old person and you can be very, very, on top of everything new. So I don't want to stereotype, but they did have a number of journalists who said, well, I don't have time to tweet. I don't have time to be on social media, or I don't know what to do on social media. So I came up with some ideas for them, and I've tweaked some of that for you today, thinking that you might find it helpful. So what I want to say here before I get to that is something that, where do you start? And if you want to be on social media and have a brand and be visible on social media and actually grow followers, my benchmark is about 20 tweets a day. You've got to be tweeting somewhat frequently to be noticed. And 20 tweets to some of you may sound like a lot. To some of you, it may not sound like very many. But to me, I think that's a really good number to start with as you sort of develop your own identity. And so, again, journalism is my focus. So I wanted to say, what should journalists tweet about? And here's a list that I came up with. And some of these you probably already know, but some of these maybe you haven't thought about lately or yet. And of course, if you're a journalist, and some of you who maybe aren't into journalism, you can sort of try to tweak this idea for your own area, whether you are a public relations person or into political, working for political candidates, or whatever job you want to go into. So journalists should tweet about journalism. Journalists should tweet about news content. That's number one. So if you're on a story, how hard is it if you're live tweeting the Oklahoma County Health Department press conference? You're going to be tweeting almost 20 tweets just in that one meeting with all the content that's coming out. So journalism. Of course, breaking news is highly important. It's one of the number one areas overall across the board, whether you work in a television station or newspaper. Breaking news is very prioritized for audiences. So breaking news, of course, being on top of breaking news. Being interactive with audiences, that's what's cool about social media. It's really one of the first times that journalists have been able to be interactive in the ways that we're interactive. So why not use that to its best use? If you're a journalist, you're going to be following all of your colleagues. And so to retweet what your colleagues are tweeting. So if my colleague is covering the Oklahoma County Health meeting, that's an important story today. So I'm going to retweet some selected tweets to support my colleague, but also to share that good information to my audiences. Yes, you can tweet to your website. So most journalism entities are going to have a website. So, if you have some good content up, you can tweet, you can link to that, of course, even though I did criticize it a little bit, but use it wisely. The other thing is connecting to older stories when it's relevant. So let's say Joe Biden had come to Oklahoma City at a certain point and someone had a sit down interview with him. Then, once he is declared president, then I would feel like, gosh, I'm going to retweet the story that I did about him because now there's a new interest. Who is this guy? So stuff like that you've done in the past with the pandemic, if someone had done a story about how to wash your hands in the past in regard to flu season, and if that were my story, I might tweet it again, later because it's still relevant. Transparency is really good to tweet about. And what I mean by that is sort of how you're doing your work. What is happening in your organization, especially when it comes to difficult stories or controversial topics. So, for example, one example of that would be on election night, the AP called the US Senate race really early, like a few minutes after 7 o'clock when polls closed. AP called that race for Senator Jim Inhofe, the incumbent. Well, his opponent was very upset by that and said, how could you do this so early? There are still people in line to vote, etc. Well, transparency means, well, how did AP do that? What's their process? And they actually have a whole write-up on how they factor in calling races, and it's really about the math, is what it's about. And so transparency is explaining that to audiences, and among other things. Perspective is, uh, I'll talk about perspective in a second. I've got an example. Personality is fine. I mean, you can share some things about yourself, but be careful with that. Don't go overboard and use it wisely. Shining the light on the audience is when there is someone who's doing good or someone you've come across that you can actually write about and shine the light back on them, as opposed to yourself. Of course, frequency is important, meaning don't just tweet, don't do a 20 tweet dump at 10 p.m. Be in that space all day. Again, that's when you're becoming more useful to people, and they know they can count on you, and they know you're not just doing a 20 tweet dump at 10 just to check a box of, gee, I better tweet my 20 tweets and be done with it. What do you find interesting? What's your thing? It could be for some people like things that I find interesting. I like history, I like archaeology, I like nature, I like scientific, deep dives into the ocean where they find like a new fish that no one has ever seen. Those are things I find interesting. And I think those are also newsworthy. Pop culture. So you can jump on a hashtag. So if something big is happening and everyone's talking about it, like a new Sharknado movie comes out, you could actually jump on that hashtag with something that fits that topic. So weather might be a good example of, gee, we don't have hashtag Sharknado tonight, but we will have some high winds in Oklahoma. So you'll actually get some notice when you're on top of a hashtag that is trending. Behind the scenes, again, use that wisely. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then creating a niche for yourself. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. So these are all the things you can tweet about. For me, I'm a teacher. Now I'm a professor, but I still kind of consider myself a journalist. I'm not working in a journalism organization. So I really represent myself as a university professor, which involves sometimes politics because I support educational funding and that sort of thing. Um, But my favorite things to tweet about for myself, if you follow me, you're going to see this. My number one favorite thing to talk about is job openings. That's really my sweet spot, is if I have a job opening in our industry that is good for our students, that's my favorite thing to tweet about. So that's part of my brand. Tweeting about journalism. Sometimes I'm a journalism critic. Sometimes I'm a journalism defender. But that's, to me, part of my role as a veteran of this industry who has studied journalism as part of my PhD work, is I want to be in that space. But I have other things I'm interested in. I will share news content because I am a news person at my heart. So, for example, I put up video last week when they came and picked up the limbs in front of my house. I just found that to be very interesting how they were doing it. They were using actually this uh, like it looked like something you'd see at a construction site to pick up all these limbs. So I like to share information and content. I shot video of the ice storm, drove down my street, shooting all the limbs down and how hard it was to get through. And a TV station in Toronto contacted me and said, "Can we use your video?" So I still am a news person, and I'm like a one woman television station is the way I see it. Kind of is it's fun to be able to share my own content out the way I see fit. But this is a list for you. Interactivity. So I talked about that. And, it's, when you have a brand and when you are a journalist, you are a member, of the community that has a higher profile. We call people like that opinion leaders. You may be an opinion leader, someone that people look to. And so you should not ignore your audience. You can ask viewers questions to kind of get story ideas. You can crowdsource. If you're working on a story and you're not finding what you need, you can actually say, "Hey, does anybody know about anybody still without power? I'm looking to do a story on that," and then see what you get. You can also set up your Twitter account to send a thank you message to people when they follow you. That's something you can do inside your Twitter settings. So if you want to have that interactivity with people. The other thing is you should be following opinion leaders, especially if you're a journalist or in whatever profession you're in. Follow the leaders of your profession because they're going to follow you back. It's going to be someone you can network with potentially, and also someone you can learn from. Now let's talk a little bit about sort of the trolls of the world. And you're going to find people who are critical. And my number one tip is you can be respectfully engaging with them, but I wouldn't get down in a war of words with them. If they just want to keep, there are some trolls that is what they get off on, is communicating back and forth with you, is knowing when to say when. And that's the second point, is learning when it's time to stop. So on Facebook, for example, some journalists are encouraged to respond to comments on stories. But by the same token, if it's a troll, you may need to remove that person if they violate your own rules on your social media, like using bad language, being hostile, being violent, that sort of thing. The other thing is, if you're in a workplace situation and you have some trolling behavior, go talk to your nearest supervisor about it to get advice on how to handle it. Me personally, I don't really have a lot of trolls because I'm not a public figure, but occasionally I might say something that engages someone who I've never heard of. And so one of my rules that I've come up with is, if a person has a fake name or a fake image and or both, I won't I'll say, I am using my real name and my real identity. I stand behind with my face and my name what I'm saying. And so if you refuse to do that yourself, then I will refuse to communicate with you, because you're hiding behind something. So that's a really good rule that has worked really well for me. One person I recommend that you follow is Abigail Ogle. I've been observing her and how she interacts with people. She is respectful, but she also has a sense of humor about it and is self-deprecating as well. But she also stands up for herself. And so I've really been interested to follow how she handles some trolling behavior. And female journalists in particular, um, for some reason, they attract these trolls who just really enjoy cutting them down. And so it's a real interesting. I think you've had some presenters talk about this topic. I think it's a really fascinating area of study right now. I talked about perspective being something you can tweet about if you don't know what to say. Here's an example of that. This was when sports announcer Bob Berry Jr. died in Oklahoma City. And the idea that one of these reporters, she went to his service and she talked about the special program they created for his service. And she just added a little perspective, that they printed 1,500 of them, but they were completely out by 10:30 in the morning. And so just little extra nuggets of background detail that may not go into any other story, perfect content to add perspective about the study or the story that you are doing. Here is a story about shining the light on the audience, or a tweet about shining the light on the audience. This was a story where Kelly Ogle tweeted about two people that put up a picture with him, and they were excited. And then he put the light back onto them. And so it's really generous way to behave. And so I saved that one as well. And then interestingly enough, Storm Jones now works at KWTV. So that was kind of a little historic moment that they tweeted about it. And now he is hired and works with Kelly. Creating a niche, I talked about that earlier. Steve Lackmeyer is a good example of someone, a journalist who has created a niche for himself. And I'm not sure if he has been a guest for you guys, but I know in the past he has spoken to this class. And one of his niches is he's really all about OKC, its history, its economy, its business climate. He's written a book about it. And so you're going to see him. So an example, he has retweeted that this new business is opening, or at the time was a new business. And then underneath, you can't see it all, but he told more about the history of the building. And that's his niche. So you're going to see Steve Lackmeyer doing a lot of just historic information and that kind of thing. So there are any number of niches that you can have for yourself. It could be that you are a journalist who's also a fitness buff, or you're a journalist who loves, the art scene in OKC. So you're going to share all that stuff out as you experience it. All of those are beneficial to the audience types of things. And that's really the guideline. Okay, behind the scenes, I mentioned that as being something you can tweet about. And I'm not into this, I'll be honest. This guy, he's a morning show anchor and talking about, he needs more coffee. I feel like I see too much of this going on. It's low hanging fruit. It doesn't really add anything to the audience. It's kind of like insider stuff, like, hey, we're all up early, we're all drinking coffee. I'm not into that. I'm not really into take a picture of me and put it up on social media and expect people to be interested in that. So I would say do your behind the scenes wisely. Our students will do this on Youth Central News. Maybe I don't always like how they do it, but it's their product, not my product. And but sometimes they'll do it beneficially, like they'll show the anchors getting ready for the show and say, election coverage is coming up in 1 hour. Stay tuned. Or, hey, election coverage is coming up in 1 hour. Polls are closing in 2 hours. We'll see you live at 6 p.m. You gave a little beneficial info there. So I'm not really big at the look at me photos that some, especially television journalists, put up. Here's an example of just breaking news, just a really quick one, which is this is a station in Sacramento, California, and they, were talking about this rescue situation, diverting crews. So now they have kind of a number of tweets started on that topic. So that's of course what you're going to do with breaking news. The other thing that I want to talk about is, okay, what about using other social media information as content for yourself? So you need to independently authenticate anything you find on a social network site. So here's an example of a station in Kansas City, KMBC, who they had a terrible situation with a football player who was injured, and they came across a photo online that they had taken of a prayer circle that happened right then and there. And so, in order to authenticate and use that on the air during the newscast, the anchor actually contacted the source of the photo, got permission to air it, and then they aired it by the end of the show. So, what this shows you is A, how to use social media generated content, the authentication process and permission process, as well as the idea that you're working throughout a newscast, even. You're constantly working to get that content, even through social media. Here are a few don'ts that I want to add. Like I said, on the behind the scenes photos, don't be too insider. Like, don't have little inside jokes that the viewers and the audience and the readers, they don't know. One of the things I think about Twitter is it's really, in some ways, it's a lot of journalists talking to each other. You're going to see that, especially you're going to see, if you follow a lot of journalists, you're going to see them um, subtweeting each other and that sort of thing. Um, and you don't want to be too insider. You also don't want to be too personal. I think you need to be careful crossing boundaries and crossing lines, because, again, this will live on whatever it is that you say. You also need to think about your safety. So you need to be careful about tweeting information that is like the front of your house that may show exactly where you live or your house number, where a bad person could come and look you up. So you need to be a little bit cautious about that. I think it's really important. This is something I really want you to take away, and that's the snarkiness that we see on social media. I think it's so easy to be snarky, and I have to fight it myself. And I've been guilty of this myself. What I try to do is I try to think a little bit before I post something. Do I own this? Do I care if everybody in the world sees it? Am I being snarky um, towards someone who really doesn't need to hear this again? Um, and so I think just it's really a good thing to think about. You don't want that to be your brand. So that's one thing that I see a lot of, and I think young people that come into these social media platforms, when you see a lot of it or you follow people like this, you start to think, well, I want to get in on it. I've got a zinger. And are you really adding anything to the conversation? The other is do you want to turn off one segment of the audience? And this is when it comes to politics. It's like, if you have strong political beliefs and you're a journalist or you work for a company and you're representing that company, remember there's a certain percentage of people on either side of the political sphere. And so if you come out there, in one way, you're going to possibly be turning off a percentage of other people. You could do that even with religious content. There are people that have different beliefs, and you may be in a bubble where it seems like everybody has the same beliefs as you do, but you may be in a community that has a segment of people that are different than how you've grown up. So think about that. And also, some people use social media as sort of a personal sounding off board. Like, let's say they have a bad travel experience and then they send all these messages to American Airlines, like, I'm mad at you. This is what you did. And that gets old. If you follow somebody that does that a lot, it's kind of like, gosh, this person is sort of bitter and gripey all the time. And so I would caution you to be really aware of yourself. And that really brings us to the last point here, which is be conscious of how others may see you through your profile. You might, every now and then, you might go through your profile and just take a look at it and look at your last 100 tweets and say, what do I look like here? What am I putting out there about myself? And you might be surprised at what you find. Um, I think that that's an interesting research project with people who have trolling behaviors. I'd like to go and study their entire profile and see, if it's a male troll that goes after female anchors, I'd love to just look at their whole profile and group their content into categories and see, what is their brand and why are they doing this? So do the same thing to yourself every so often. Okay, I think that's it. I know there's so many questions I would like to answer and so much more I would like to say, but I think we'll wrap it here and let Joe Haidt decide how he wants you to communicate to me. But I'm always here. I'm always on Twitter, obviously, and hopefully I will have some of you in class later on, and hopefully I already have some of you in class. So thank you so much for your attention today.